Hey guys, I'm Spencer Hogan, and I actually ended up doing my paper on coevolutionary relationships. So let me go ahead and screen share to my PowerPoint. Okay, so once again, it's coevolutionary relationships. Just as a brief introduction, my definition for coevolution, if you're not familiar, is two or more species in a mutually reciprocating and exclusive ecological relationship. That's kind of my summed up version of coevolution. The one in my paper is like massive, so I shortened it for you guys. One of the examples that we might be familiar with, because it's in a lot of those biology textbooks, has to do with this picture. And what it is it's actually from the Hudson's Bay Company, or the HBC, which was run by the British in the 1800s, as you can see in the graph. And what they were doing is, just like everyone else in the New World, I guess a big way to make money was to get into the trapping and fur trading business. And so these records are actually how many pelts they had. And so as you can see, it fluctuates. We can see that the snowshoe hare is in blue and the lynx is in red. And some years, for example, right in here, somewhere in probably the 60s, late 60s, you had this huge increase in hare pelts that were captured. And you can kind of relate it to the number of lynx pelts. And that sort of can be used now as a kind of like a generalized population of how many we think might have been there at that time. And for example, like how I use this line, this spike right here of hair, it probably had to do a lot with this very low point in lynx. And so because there's a low point in lynx, that meant that the hair could somewhat overpopulate. And so this is just a classic example of coevolution because it shows how the hare and lynx populations affect each other, and it's a predator-prey relationship. So basically, even though that is a predator-prey relationship, I'm going to be talking about the mutually beneficial coevolutionary relationships like we see in plant and pollinators. So for example, I discussed 6 specific examples, and I'll break them down just kind of like how I did in my paper. And I think the interesting thing is that there are really a lot of examples, and I had to kind of pick and choose based which ones had the best articles, but there's a lot, and I hope this will interest you enough to go look at the other ones. But I think another key thing is that pollinators range from mammals to birds to insects, like it says there. The reason I included that is because I think when I think of pollinators, at least a lot of times I think of insects. And so I'm just including an example of a mammal and an example of a bird, and then multiple examples of insects in my paper. And then the plants being pollinated are predominantly trees, but there are some of kind of what you might think is like perennial flowers and whatnot. The first example I have is acacia trees and acacia ants. Lucky for you, I get to slaughter a lot of genus species names. But anyways, so the acacia trees are also known as the swollen thorn acacia trees or the bullhorn acacia trees. And what I did here is I just broke it down into 2 columns. Pretty much what the ants over here, the Pseudomyrmex ferruginea, what they do for the acacia tree, and then over here I have what the tree does for the ants. So it's what they're gaining is what's under their name. So the acacia trees here are gaining protection. So the ants will attack harmful insects, and then they'll also attack the mammals and other larger hazards, is the way I summed it up. That'll eat the leaves. So if, I don't know, for example, a cow or something comes up and starts eating on the leaves, the ants will actually kind of viciously attack it and start biting its nose and stuff, so it backs off its tree. The other thing the plants, the acacia trees, get out of this relationship is that they don't have to put up with a lot of competition. So as you can see here, ants will attack any encroaching plants in contact with their host canopy. And as well, if they find any seedlings in the vicinity of their host plant, they'll actually go and cut it down. So it's ensuring that its plant is going to get the most nutrients. And what the ants get in return is a nice food source. And there are these things called Belgian bodies, and I have a picture for you in just a second. But what they are is they're these little yellow bodies on the leaves that contain sugary nectars. And so that's where they get pretty much the vast majority of their food source. And the other thing they get from the trees is they have a home base, or they can, they have a place for their colony. So inside these bulbous thorns, they actually cut into them, and they're kind of hollow, and so they can inhabit them. And the unique thing about the thorns is when they kind of drill into them, it won't damage the tree in any way. So here's a picture. As you can see in this top left picture, you can see the holes in the thorns that the ants can go in and out of. And then down here, you see these little yellow bodies. Those are the Belgian bodies that they get a lot of their nectar and food from. But to sum it up, the trees and ants from the study I read about, they have become mutually exclusive, meaning the ants are only known now to live on the trees, and the trees can only survive with the protection of the ants. So they've kind of become weak. But together they're very strong, and so they've created this interdependent relationship. My next example has to do with figs and pollinator wasps. This one's pretty cool too. So we have our figs over here, the Ficus sycamoris, and what they get is that they become pollinated. So when these wasps, so there's really no one specific wasp, it's any from the family Aegionidae. So when those wasps will come, and they'll come in oviposit, which just means they use this kind of hollow tube as a reproductive organ. They use it to lay their eggs. So that's what oviposit is, and they lay them inside the flowers or inside the figs themselves. And when that happens, the wasp will pick up pollen, and they'll transfer it from tree to tree, fig to fig. And additionally, when the eggs hatch inside the fig, when those wasps leave, they'll have some pollen on them as well. And so when they go off, they'll be carrying this specific fig. It'll be carrying its genetics. And so that's what the tree gets out of it. Now the wasps are given a place to oviposit, right? So they have a safe place to lay their eggs. And along with that, as the eggs hatch, they immediately have a food supply. So it's another mutually exclusive relationship that has occurred, that the wasps rely on these figs, and these figs rely on the wasps for pollination. Next example is the Joshua tree and yucca moth. So Yucca brevifolia is the Joshua tree, and then for the yucca moths, once again, it's not a single moth, but it's any of these from the genus Tegeticula. And so the trees, once again, just like we saw with the figs, is they get pollinated. And the really interesting thing about the Joshua tree is that they don't produce a nectar or a fruit like the figs to attract other insects. And because of that, insects aren't going to come, right? So they pretty much, their benefit is that they provide a suitable place for moths to oviposit. Once again, that just means they can lay their eggs. And as they do that, they'll pick up pollen from the Joshua tree, and they'll carry it from tree to tree. And then the yucca moths, just like the wasps, they get a place to oviposit, a safe place where their young can develop, and they have a food supply, and it's their only food supply. So they've created another interdependent relationship where they rely specifically on each other. So here's a picture of a Joshua tree, so you can see how it might not produce nectar or anything too exciting. It's out in the desert. And these yucca moths will come up, and they can oviposit into the flowers whenever this blossoms. Next, so those were insects. Now we have a bird example. So the Xanthus is hummingbird, and then more specifically the Texas madrone, which is a tree. And the really cool thing about this one is that they're both endemic. And so basically what that means is that they are exclusively in one area. And that area is Baja California Sur, which I'll show you on a map in just a second. But the madrone, the tree, they have a very unique flower pollination, meaning that their flowers are strongly constricted, so it makes it hard for some other insects and other animals that would normally pollinate for them. But the hummingbirds, the Xanthus hummingbirds, they have pretty unique beaks that, I guess, it breaks the puzzle of the flowers. And so the flowers require the hummingbirds now for pollination, because no other pollinators can figure out their flowers, so they die without the hummingbirds. And the hummingbirds, meanwhile, will get a food supply. The biggest thing about it is that because those flowers are so unique, the hummingbirds have created an exclusive relationship that only they can exploit. No other insects or birds can fight them for that food supply. So they've really exploited it. And then the other interesting thing that might be the determining reason why this relationship got developed is because the madrones, they bloom year-round. And so the hummingbirds, who are going to live in California, or Baja California Sur, they're going to need a food supply in the winter, and so they'll have those blossoms. And so onto the pictures, we have our Xanus hummingbird in this beak. You can see how it curves. And then we have our flowers over here. They're kind of bulbous looking. And then we have our study area, which is Baja California Sur. And so the reason it's kind of become endemic is because, as you can see, there's little green areas where the trees can grow, and then you have these dry desert areas along the side, and then you have ocean on the other side. So these two species are kind of trapped together, and they form this relationship. And this example might be more out of necessity. They know that they're going to be together in a certain area, and so now they rely on each other because they knew that would be around. They knew that the trees would be there blossoming during the winter, and the trees know that the hummingbirds can, crack the coat of their flowers. And so that's the bird example. Now we have our mammal example between the tube-looped nectar bat and the Centropogon nigricans, which is a tropical flower. Kind of like how we just read about the madrone flowers being tricky. These flowers have extremely long corollas, which is just pretty much this whole part. So you can see how that's very long. It makes it tricky for other insects and other, whatever's going to try and pollinate them to get the nectar down here at the bottom. They can't reach it. It's going to be pretty ineffective for them to go down there. But the tube-looped bat, or the Odora fistulata, has an extremely long tongue for its size. And the reason it has that is because it's developed a thoracic glossal tube, which means that the tongue can basically sit back here in the thoracic cavity, whereas other bats, their tongue is restricted to the size of their jaw. So it's only maybe 4 centimeters long, and this bat can go past 6 centimeters long. So it definitely gives them the upper edge. And because of this, because of the flowers being so long, it's been proposed that the bats, out of a selective pressure, have developed longer tongues to fit that. And now they've made an exclusive relationship with each other where this flower can only be pollinated by this bat, and this bat gets its food supply from this flower because they're kind of made for each other. They've evolved to be together. They co-evolved. And so, of course, the flower will get pollination as the bat comes in. The pollen will actually rub off on like its forehead. So when it goes to the next flower, it'll rub off and so forth. And then, of course, the bat gets a nice sweet nectar that's exclusive to them, and no other bat species can get to it. And then my last example is between the leaf flower tree and the leaf flower moths. So the leaf flower tree are from the Glochidian genera, and the moths are from the Epicephala genera. So like our other insect examples, the tree can only be pollinated by the Epicephala moths. And the real reason why is because these trees have been kind of island hopping throughout Southeast Polynesia. So they needed something that could pollinate them, that could follow them, and these moths do just that. They co-radiate together. They spread out together. So the tree flowers are pollinated by being spread by the moth. And then the moths, out of it, they get a safe place to oviposit once again, and it's their only place they oviposit. As you can see in this picture, you can see how it's sticking down into the bud right here. And it also provides a food supply. Once again, it gives it, the pollen, and it's able to transfer that. And the unique thing about this relationship is that it's co-radiation. There's two species that are kind of following each other throughout these islands, and they're exclusive to each other. And so just some general conclusions from my paper is that coevolution is a formidable and effective mode of evolution. So it hasn't had a lot of steam, but it's starting to gain some steam in the evolution world as being more of a noticeable. We've seen more instances of it, and we see that it works and it can be mutually beneficial, which is what I have down here. For instance, the one in our bats has to do with this statement. It may be initiated in nature due to selective pressures. So those flowers created long corollas, and so the bats evolved to match that to make it exclusive. So that's a selective pressure. Species may begin these relationships to eliminate competition. So if you think back to our hummingbird example, how it's in an endemic area, they're both endemic to an area. It was proposed that these may begin those relationships in order to eliminate competition, meaning that the hummingbirds won't have any competition with other hummingbirds, and those trees won't have competition with other trees. There's going to be a reliable, steady mutualism or coevolution. so they don't have to worry about competition. And then, like I mentioned earlier, most certainly can be mutually beneficial. A lot of times coevolution can be seen as parasitic, or for example, in our introduction, we talked about the lynx and the hares and how it's a predator-prey and it's not going to benefit, but throughout my paper, I've tried to prove that it can be mutually beneficial. And then lastly, it can happen under a variety of circumstances in the ecosystem. So we learned about endemic species between the hummingbird. We learned about co-radiation between the tree flower moths. And one general summarization, if I could, it seems to be more common in constant, unchanging environments where these two or more different species, they kind of become used to each other, and so they kind of form this coevolution where they know that they can rely on each other, and so they kind of make it mutually exclusive so that only they can exploit each other. And then these are my references. These are my articles from the paper. I have my picture references, and that's about it. Let me just get back here. So thanks for watching, guys.